Hi, this is Brad Linder with Liliputing, and I'm just going to do a quick video review here of the Acer Aspire One 522. This is a 10-inch netbook-sized computer, netbook-like pricing, around $350, I believe, and it has sort of a netbook-like processor. It's an AMD C-50. So if you've been used to seeing most netbooks with AMD or Intel Atom processors, this has a AMD solution. It's a dual-core processor, but it's only at 1 gigahertz. It offers actually, in many tests, very similar performance to what you would see from an Intel Atom chip in terms of both battery life and overall performance. But it also has on that same chip the ATI, or actually AMD Radeon 6250 graphics, which are much more powerful than the integrated graphics that you would get with an Intel Atom chip. Can handle 1080p video playback, 3D accelerated video, some games, etc. So overall, the performance is pretty impressive for a relatively inexpensive, thin, light laptop. Now, one of the things that really surprised me about this, though, is that I tested the Acer Aspire One. Make sure that everything's in the frame here. The Acer Aspire One 521 not too long ago, and that particular laptop had a previous generation AMD processor. So this is one of the first AMD Fusion chips, meaning that the same piece of silicon has the processor, the CPU, and the graphics processor, and that's supposed to lead to better power consumption, possibly better battery life, so more efficient process all told. And as it turns out, the battery life on this is almost identical to the 521, and that machine had an AMD single-core 1.6, 1.7 gigahertz processor, I believe, and that was the K125 AMD Neo processor, and Radeon 4225 graphics. And performance is very similar in terms of graphics, but that one actually had a much faster processor. So similar battery life, but I was able to do things like compress video or create a zip file, things that really rely on the CPU, faster on that machine, even with a single-core processor, because it was a faster single-core processor. So why might you still be interested then in this next-generation product? Well, for one thing, you've got a higher resolution screen. This is a 1280 by 720 pixel screen, and so you can fit a lot more on the display. And because you've got the high definition graphics, you can play 720p video in native resolution and it's going to look fine. You can view more web content at the same time. Let's go ahead and launch a web browser here. And so, for instance, if you go to this is the New York Times website, which should be loading. Here we go. You see you've actually got extra space on the sides here, as opposed to on a typical netbook with a 1024 by 600 pixel display, where you might actually sort of run off the edges. Not quite sure why everything's loading quite so slow right now. Same goes for my website. If you go to Liliputing, it was actually designed so that it would fit on a netbook fairly well, and you can see that these bars here, that's sort of the limits of a 1024 by 600 pixel display, but here you've actually got a little bit of white space on the sides. Now, if you think that things are too sharp, you've got room to zoom in. And back to regular. In the past, I've been a little bit critical, I think, of 10-inch displays that do have these high-resolution screens. Sometimes it can be a little bit hard to read text. It's so much sharper. But I think 1280 by 720 is actually a pretty good resolution, whereas just a little bit higher resolution at a 1366 by 768 I find a little bit more disconcerting. Or maybe I'm just getting more used to it the more I use this. But I kind of like the screen resolution, and I find that there are certain things that are just a lot easier to do. For instance, when I work on a computer, I'm spending a lot of time blogging, and in order to do that, I often have two windows open, and I can put two windows side by side here and see text in one and write in the other. And you can see I've also got a sidebar that I've actually moved all the way to the side there, so I can get even more space if I don't do that. And so, now you can see that you're not getting the full New York Times website, but you can read a complete article if you really needed to. Or you can get an ad. There we go. So we've got the full text of that article, full text of these articles, all on the screen at the same time. Now, in terms of battery life, as I mentioned, it gets about the same battery life as the Acer Aspire One 521, which is around 5 hours to 5 hours 15 minutes. Depends what you do. If you're watching video, you might get a little bit less. But in my testing, surfing the web, playing music, doing things like that, watching a couple of videos on and off, about 5 hours seems reasonable. Now, you're going to get better battery life out of some of the newer systems with Intel Atom processors. I've seen some that get as much as 8 to 10 hours of battery life, and some other AMD systems as well, but this has a 49 watt-hour battery, and 5 hours seems to be about par for the course. Just to show you a little bit about the graphics, before we quit here, this is the Street Fighter 4 benchmark, and I ran this test previously, but I just want to show you what it looks like. You can adjust the graphic elements at sort of the standard graphic resolution. I've noticed that this particular test gets an E, basically, on a grade scale of A to F, it gets an E. And in terms of frames per second, it was getting around 15 to 20 frames per second, I think. And that's at a resolution of 1280 by 720 with full screen mode on, variable frame rate, and so forth. So let's go back. Anti-aliasing is off. Stretch, variable brightness, parallel rendering, texture filter. So, I mean, you could adjust the screen resolution if you wanted to, but yeah. So let's go ahead and run just the beginning of this test so you can see what the game looks like. So for older games, your performance is probably going to be a lot better. But just for comparison, I have a hard time even running this benchmark on a system with an Intel Atom processor and integrated GMA 3150 graphics. So you can see we're getting about 17 frames per second here. We're averaging around 19 to 20 frames per second. So, the game's playable. You'd probably want to reduce the graphics settings if you wanted to play it at full 30 frames per second. But, it's playable at this rate. Just taking another quick look around the sides, we've got a power cable there, we've got a VGA port, HDMI, 2 USB. Looks like a little vent over here. On the other side, we've got one more USB for a total of 3, SD card slot, mic and headphone, Ethernet, and the keyboard, we've got sort of one big wide button below the keyboard, below the touchpad for left and right clicks. It's not the best I've ever used, but you can tap on the touchpad if you need to, and the touchpad has a fairly nice feel and a nice wide design. The keyboard has nice big flat keys. Takes a little getting used to because it's kind of hard to detect the difference between one key and the next with your fingertips, but it's possible. And down here we've got sort of the typical Acer squashed arrow keys with the page up, page down, home and end. Takes a little bit of getting used to, but it's not too bad. Overall, definitely not too bad a touch typing experience. Good display, good graphics, and there you go. That's the Acer 522.